the topic of feedback and how it applies in our roles as leaders and as coaches is, of course, well, you're going to have to look far and wide to find topics that are more important than that. And especially in these times with all the changes going on and the stuff happening with like digitalization and automation and all our knowledge becoming unusable so quickly, the idea of teaching your people to learn stuff quickly, and by that also, of course, receiving feedback in a good way, probably is one of the most important things you can do. So we have some interesting figures on the topic of like coaching and tailored feedback, don't we, Saul?
We do. The figures come from an organisation called Gartner, and it's up here behind us now on this slide. We won't take you through every column, but what the big takeaway from this slide is that the single most important thing that you can do for maximising the effectiveness of your coaching and your feedback is to tailor the feedback to the unique needs and preferences of the coachee. So in other words, the big nudge here is it's the single largest item by about 3. It's 46% out of 100, is tailor your feedback to the perceived or established needs and preferences of the coachee.
Yep. One of the very important things to remember when you are a feedback giver is, of course, the idea that when you try to feed back to anyone else in your life, whether it actually is at home or at work, you are never God and you are never correct. You know, the idea that when we give feedback to each other, you are always and forever just some other person trying to feedback on how whatever happened seemed to you. In other words, feedback is always a subjective thing. And to highlight what I mean by that, I think feedback can turn out so wrong when it's given in the wrong way. And I have a friend of mine, and she's a professor at a musical regional college in Norway, where I come from. And she has this story, which is about how once a month, when she started her professorship, once a month at this university, she's a teacher, of music, and she's a teacher of like how to, they try to teach people to become musical artists and create songs and work as musicians. So at this regional college, once a month, there would be like a feedback session where the student would be sat in front of his or her peers, and the whole year that they were in would all listen to the one performer on stage, and when their song or whatever piece of music they'd created was finished, the whole year, the whole group of people would feed back to that person. So, of course, in the audience, you have all your fellow co-students who have whatever relationship they have to you, as it were. You take on a certain role in the gang, as it were, and the people's feedback are, well, you can hear it, can't you? Like totally subjective, of course. The person on stage, this is what my professor friend experienced when she first encountered this strange ritual, was that the people on stage very rarely walked away with anything useful. Because, of course, what was happening was just that a lot of students were kind of feeding back to the person how they felt about them. Or music is such a weird thing to give feedback on any old how. So what is the morale of this story? Basically that remembering that it's always to do with context, it's always to do with situation, and it's always to do with relationship when we feed back to other people. We should actually remember this both as givers and receivers of feedback.
And you've just mentioned a professor, which is a nice little prompt for me, maybe, or a segue for some research in the last 4 or 5 years from Harvard. And just before we take you into the Ergo Ego recommended feedback system, the Harvard model, the Harvard ratio, as we like to call it now, was based on a survey of team effectiveness through the lens of how did they use negative and positive comments and suggestions within that team. And when they talked about effectiveness, they were talking about things like financial performance, customer satisfaction, how good were they with their 360 feedback. And what was really interesting of that, the high-performing teams in the Harvard survey had a ratio of 5.6 to 1 positive to negative comments. So nearly 6 to 1. The medium-performing teams in that same study were around 1.6, I think 1.7. And the low-performing teams against those KPIs, interestingly enough, about 0.36 to 1. In other words, the low-performing teams were making on average, 3 negative type comments or giving 3 negative pokes on average versus every one thing that was positive. So the Harvard ratio is quite a useful handrail for those of us who are involved regularly in giving feedback. Again, if in doubt, 5 to 1 is pretty good. Whatever else it is you've heard before.
I also so totally on a personal level relate to that those figures. And if you do look at the best paid feedback givers on the planet these days, I would probably argue it is the people who train top athletes. Now, it's been decades since those trainers stopped actually picking away at whatever it was that those top athletes were doing wrong and started instead complimenting everything that that particular talent or top achiever was doing good and well and right. So if you look at, they're probably the people on the planet who are paid the most money to give feedback, and their feedback kind of has to work. And they've been giving compliments for decades. Maybe it's time that we follow suit, huh? Yeah.
And then to wrap this, we have this Ergo Ego sort of recommended model. Do you
Yes,
want to
we
just dance us through this?
I would love to. So, of course, the idea here is that after years and years of just giving trainings and, of course, coming across different feedback models in the Ergo Ego world, this is our favorite recipe these days. And out of all the models and recipes that we've come across, this very simple little thing just kind of divides the art of giving feedback into 3, where point number 1 is actually describing practically and as objectively as possible what actually took place in the situation that you're feedbacking on. Step number 2 then is to give your more subjective interpretation of that effect that the situation had on you. So if we now take the example, for instance, of a presenter presenting and maybe presenting a little bit quickly, the way in which to do it according to this recipe would be to go, so I just heard you presenting and you kind of, you had about 17 slides and I think you spent, 7 minutes in total? And I couldn't hear you taking any pauses in there, and the tempo with which you spoke seemed to be a little bit higher than the person before you. These are all polite ways of kind of saying that was a bit quick. Then step number 2 would be for me to go, the effect this had on me was that you seemed a bit stressed. This is following a recipe of not kind of explaining to the other who they are or how they came across, but giving them the idea of something objective that had then been given a subjective interpretation. Step number 3, just to be human about it and to be polite about it too, I would very much recommend that you open up for conversation at this point. So you're giving the feedback, you've given the context, you've given the interpretation that you came up with. Now is the time to go, if I say that to you, how does that make you feel? Or would you agree with what I just said? Or anything that would make the other person reflect. Then, having done that, of course, if you get to step number 4 in our little recipe, when we are feedback givers, it also implies us being able to give advice or even to challenge, to champion, or like we've just already mentioned, giving a good compliment. So if you follow the recipe, you kind of go, so that seemed like you had 17 slides, 7 minutes, you didn't take very many pauses. And to me, the effect it had on me was that you felt a bit rushed. How does that feel for you when I say that? And then when you get the answer, you go, so if I'm allowed to give you a piece of advice, and then you either advise on change or you compliment whatever it was they were doing. Championing in itself is, of course, a way of complimenting, but it's a kind of compliment that will encourage the other and give them courage to actually try again. So if I give a good championing, I would kind of be going, do you remember last year when you gave that other presentation and you managed to stay so calm throughout the whole thing? I am sure if we just try again, you'll be perfectly able to do it calmly this time. Why don't you give it a go? So this is me being encouraging and supporting and all of that.
And that's also sympathetic to the Harvard ratio, the whole thing of championing and complimenting. And just to take you through, we thought it would be maybe a little bit unwise to completely ignore what are the pointers from Ergo Ego on the receiving end of feedback. So just a few pointers for all of us. Again, both of you, coach and coachee, listen well without interrupting is the goal. Maintaining positive non-verbal signals. It's very easy for things that are going on in your head at the time to show up in some way in your facial expression, in your voice, in your body. They're little giveaways that we send. So it's just being a little bit more mindful of managing those non-verbal signals in the most effective way, sending the right signals. Asking for an example if you don't understand. It's great to bring things out of the abstract. Bring it out of the abstract into the real. Could you just describe for me how that might look then? Or just get them talking, for real, rather than in the abstract. And of course, choose what works for you. This is good for both of us, but on the receiving end again, the coachee has a responsibility to help you learn their dance.
Now, if I am advising you, if you are a leader listening into this film, this receiving part is probably the most important thing we can do. Because if we stop receiving feedback or allowing feedback, the more you grow into leadership, it's actually the possibility that people around you, they will shut up and they will not give you feedback unless you actually ask for it. So encouraging feedback is the way to ensure that also leaders grow, as we all should continue to do.
Just an important part of the coach's toolkit, and some good pointers in there for all of us, I think.
Thank you.